Our first item this morning is to take evidence on broadcasting. The committee published a report on broadcasting last May, which focused on BBC Scotland's capacity to handle forthcoming major events, namely the referendum and the Commonwealth Games. We will take evidence from representatives of BBC Scotland later, but we'll hear first from Professor John Robertson. In February this year, Professor Robertson published research on the BBC's and STV's coverage of the referendum campaign, which will of course be of direct relevance to our later discussions. Can I welcome Professor Robertson to the committee and invite him to make a brief opening statement? Professor
Thanks
Robertson.
very much. Thank you to the committee for allowing me to do this, because much has happened. Am I too close to that? Much has happened in the month or so since I released the research paper. Much of it has been quite upsetting for me. So I want to begin by saying some fairly strong things about my experience in the last month or so. I'd like to condemn the behaviour of BBC Scotland's Department of Policy and Corporate Affairs in suppressing the dissemination of my research and in circulating an insulting and ill-informed critique of my research directly to my principal, bypassing my head of school, my dean, straight to the principal, and also circulating that to all email complaints they had about their coverage of the referendum. I'd like, secondly, to condemn, and the audience is not always here for this condemnation. I appreciate you're not part of that. I'm sorry if this seems a bit dramatic, a bit kind of over the top, but it's been a very stressful month. I'd like to condemn the silence and collusion of almost all of Scotland's mainstream media in disappearing my research, despite its massive online presence. Its online presence is a news item which has been ignored. I have my suspicions, but I don't know for certain. And thirdly, I'd like to, unfortunately, to condemn the silence of almost all Scottish academics with an interest in this field, who might have been expected to challenge censorship of intellectual material. I've been personally hurt by the above combination of threat from a powerful institution. There have been no horse's head in my bed yet. I suppose that's always something. Abandonment by the mainstream media and by academia, other than my own immediate colleagues. I must give thanks to my immediate colleagues. I interpret the above as an attempt at thought control in a democracy, and of all democracies, the one I like the best. I'm very upset by that. So, happy to respond now to any questions about, or back to Chair, I guess.
Thank you very much, Professor Robertson. If we can move on to the main issue that we want to discuss today, which is, as you say, your own research. Can I ask a sort of general opening question? Could you just lay out for us what your research, well, the first part of your research, I know it's a 2-year programme, but the first year you published, as you say, about a month ago. Could you just lay out some of the findings of that first year's worth of research?
Well, it shows a crude quantitative imbalance between the number of statements reported which you could see as supportive of the Yes campaign and those you could see as supportive of the No campaign. There's a high degree of subjectivity in all of this, I appreciate. All social, political, historical research is subjective. I am committed to a kind of research which is often referred to as grounded theory. I take it very, very seriously. I try to hold back as much as I can. I teach students about this. I have been doing for 30 years, teaching students about the importance of not leaping in the way that journalists often do, I'm afraid to say. And so that seemed to grab everybody's attention. Yes campaigners on the web immediately flew up into a kind of fury of, evidence at last, 3-to-2 ratio. My feeling was that the 3-to-2 ratio wasn't very important, actually, because a lot of it was down to just saying, well, let's hear what the Liberal Democrat says, let's hear what the Conservative says. And that led to an imbalance of a quantitative nature. What I thought was far more important and drew less attention, I think, was there are 3 or 4 items. One was sequence, and that's the common tendency in that period to begin with bad news. Now, there is a lot of evidence that audiences are quite resilient to political messages. They're less resilient when it comes to the economy. They're much more likely to believe bad news stories. So I would suggest that beginning with bad news stories about the economy, about job losses and so on, has a disproportionate influence. And there was a tendency, especially for Reporting Scotland, to begin with bad news stories more than the other channels. Now, I should say I've been doing a kind of snapshot of February at the moment, and the picture for Reporting Scotland is massively improved for February, the period after my research blew up. I won't claim credit for that necessarily, but the picture for BBC One has dramatically worsened in terms of imbalance, almost like BBC One has entered the fray to present bad news stories. I think the personalisation of the First Minister and the conflation, this was mentioned by journalists at the weekend, the conflation of the Yes agenda with Alex Salmond's personal wishes and his face on screen was disproportionately done. We hardly ever heard the suggestion that Alistair Darling wants this, Alistair Darling wants that, and so on. With due respect, I think both capable of being made into figures of fun by the media, where they had the intention to do so. So I thought that was unbalanced. And also, I think that the kind of respect, the undue respect shown to political organisations like the Office for Budget Responsibility or the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the idea that they are impartial is deeply wrong. And any social scientist will provide you with the evidence that they are also political animals. And their research should be treated with the same caution as research coming, say, from the Scottish Office. I'm in danger of forgetting. Those, I think, were the main points, actually, that I thought were...
It's fine, Professor Robertson. We're going to get into some of the detail, I'm sure, when members want to ask questions. I'm going to start the questioning with Claire Adamson.
Good morning, Professor, and thank you very much for your opening statement. We've all taken on board your comments regarding what has happened to you since the publication of your report.
In the interim as well.
I did know that.
So I did think it was delayed. It took months and months, and I thought, have I shot myself in the foot there? But my new principal is Australian. He doesn't give a 4x about any of this, I don't think.
My question's about the methodology that you used in your research, and I note from your written evidence you say the coding which led to the evidence of bias emerged from a grounded theory, phenomenological, and you would get that wrong, approach which allows the data to speak. Can you enlighten us about where this methodology has been used before and
it's long-standing in the social. It's long-standing in the social sciences. By long-standing, I mean as far back as maybe the 70s. Around the time I was an undergraduate, there was beginnings of a shift from a more positivist approach, where rather arrogant social scientists thought they knew what was in the evidence before they went looking for it. Now, I should say, and this is not crawling here, but feminist methodology has been very influential in this, and there's been a strong suggestion that the move towards a more qualitative approach, which allows the evidence to emerge rather than the evidence being selected, it derives from a shift, a greater presence of women in social science research. It's clearly not perfect. It's clearly not perfect, but it's an intention. Ian Bell, the only journalist who's really mentioned my research at all, Ian Bell commented on the fact that I was committed, and he agreed to fairness and self-awareness. Now, there's a lot of talk about journalism educators, about balance, about bias, and so on. And these are all very subjective areas. I think you can't really achieve them. What you can do is have the really good intention to be self-aware of yourself all the time, and to look and to be fair to the evidence, not to be going in with preconceptions. Sorry, very long answer.
and just can you give us an indication? I know you've submitted it, but in what period of time was the research conducted by yourself?
The first block is September to September in the first year of the period since the announcement of the referendum date. I'm currently working on the second year, and I think I mentioned before, someone asked me, given that, you see, one of the problems with this was that mostly I published in peer-reviewed journals which would largely encourage you to stay well away from politics. It's a rather sad fact that intellectuals have become quite detached from politics, to my mind, and I think there's a place for some kind of engagement, as long as it's an intelligent engagement. Now, I was urged by Scottish Affairs to sit on the whole thing until it was finished. That struck me as pointless in some way, because I didn't come in here to actually... What I was hoping to do was actually improve coverage. Improve. Not necessarily... I didn't think I would necessarily shift it one way or the other, but I thought maybe, rather naively, I thought the BBC's Department of whatever, self-improvement, if there is one, that they might have actually looked at this and thought, interesting, let's invite him along for a chat about it. But they just reported me to the principal. Did I answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yes, you did answer my question. And if I could just return to your opening statement, just finally, you talked about your academic colleagues. and the reaction of the BBC to your research. Are you aware of the BBC having this level of criticism and involvement on any other research in Scotland?
No, I haven't. It's, there's an online blog which is at the moment comparing me with Professor Curtis at Strathclyde. Now, I'm not going to say anything offensive to Professor Curtis, obviously, but one of the commentators said, "I'll explain it to you," he said. "Professor Curtis is Premier League. This Robertson guy is playing in the reserves at Elgin City." There's that kind of thing is happening in the background, that there are huge bodies of research which are not being questioned. Now, Professor Curtis's research, and I can say this without being insulting to him, is based on sampling. He and his team sample maybe 1,000 people to represent the electorate of Scotland. How many million? Reduced to 1,000. That introduces massive potential for distortion. And I think you can see that in the ineffectiveness of polling over a long period of time. I did no selection. That's one of the reasons I'm quite angry, is I did no selection, I did it all. I took all of the broadcasting from 6 till 7 for the whole year. I didn't select it, because if you start to select, then obviously people can say, "Oh, you missed something." You know, you just happened unluckily to choose the bad news.
Thank you.
Joan?
A quick supplementary on your methodology. What kind of research have you done in the past? Is this the first time you've looked at Scottish politics?
It's the first time. My interest is in. My interest is in thought control in democracies. Everyone knows in a totalitarian state you can't trust the media. Everybody knows they're being lied to. Thought control in totalitarian states is totally ineffective, because the entire population pretty much don't trust that stuff from the party. In democracies there is thought control. There's undeniably thought control. Media and political elites often work in each other's interests. They don't get round a big cauldron. It's like, let's do down the working classes and send our boys off to die because we want them to do that. They just mix. They go to the same schools. Their children go to the same schools. They share the same interests, the same cultural interests. So we do end up with a degree of thought control without conspiracy, through self-censorship, where members of elites act in their own interests and therefore in the interests of that elite. Now, I've done research for many years now into media coverage of war, of the economy. This is the first piece of research I've ever done that's attracted any interest. It's all in academic journals with, the occasional postgraduate student writing to me, and I think, oh, at least I've influenced one person with this. Most of it, I think, was more controversial than this. This just happened because of the time, I guess. I've been a bit naive. I just finished a piece of research on the coverage of the BBC, the TV coverage of the cabin crew strike. Remember the cabin crew strike at British Airways and so on? I thought that would be interesting because of the gender dimension to all of that. That cabin crew are quite different from rail crew, for example. Now, that was the thing. I just finished it. My contract expects me to produce research and to have that submitted for review. And I looked around and thought, what would be interesting right now? Really. I just thought that. And when I published it, I was really quite surprised at the email from Mr. Small at the BBC. It really quite took me off guard. That's maybe naivety. I may be slightly autistic. I do a lot of quantitative stuff, and I think maybe I've got a slightly autistic streak there that I don't pick up political always. Sorry, again a long answer.
Liam MacArthur.
Good morning, Professor Robertson. Reading with interest the report you've provided to the committee, and with your opening remarks there, you were drawing attention to what you saw as the conflation of the First Minister and his views and perspectives on independence with somehow a line of attack that was unique to those seeking to retain the Union. Would you say that there's a similar tendency by the First Minister and by the Yes campaign more broadly to characterise the Union as somehow to do with David Cameron, George Osborne, posh Southern Tories, whatever you will? And so in a sense, what you're seeing is an echo on both sides of a personalisation of politics, which is going which is going on across all elections in all political contexts.
I can only again talk to the period I surveyed. And in the period I surveyed, and I will admit it wasn't across the whole year, it was particularly in the first 6 months, was the intensity of what I would see as demonisation of the First Minister. It reminded me very strongly of how Michael Foot, many of you may be a bit young for Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock were treated by the media, made fool of, so as to associate a fool with a political stance. Now, I think, I don't know because I haven't done the data yet, but I think George Osborne has been picked out in quite a similar way recently. And I think, to be fair, I think the Scottish media have been quite keen to jump on George Osborne. We've seen Bernard Ponsonby shouting at him, and everybody no doubt cheering at that. So I think there may be a truth in that, but in the period I covered, a very, very heavy imbalance. Hardly ever was there a suggestion that Joanne Lamont wanted anything. And yet, again, the potential to demonise Joanne Lamont just as easy as the potential to demonise Alex Salmond.
Does that not throw up a possible problem with the way in which you approach the research, in that the association with, I would say particularly David Cameron, with what was happening in relation to reform of welfare and other difficult decisions being taken at the UK level, was being conflated with the independence debate, and in very much the same way as Alex Salmond was being conflated with.
It wasn't in that year.
It was that.
It was, but it just wasn't in that year. I remember again, my commitment is to record what is there, and that tendency was much weaker than the tendency to commonly associate Alex Salmond with everything, and to open with Alex Salmond this and Alex Salmond that.
I'd be very surprised if between September 2012 and September 2013 there wasn't extensive coverage at UK and at Scottish level about welfare reform and attacks by Alex Salmond and SNP ministers about what was happening in terms of welfare reform, or indeed in terms of cuts to budgets to deal with economic crisis.
Welfare reform, the way a welfare reform story is presented might not be directly concerned with the referendum.
Well,
I mean, you could. I appreciate you could take it that way.
Yeah, well, in a sense, you then refer to in the report here health-related matters, and obviously health is a matter entirely devolved to the Scottish Parliament. So I'm not entirely sure what the point is that's being made here in relation to reports of issues of a health-related nature with regards to the referendum.
Well, I think I agree there is a subjective decision to be made in looking at this material and deciding where to put it. And I am open to the suggestion that someone else, another team, would come along and move things about a bit. I don't think they'd make a big difference. I suspect that if you were to bring in fairly naive undergraduates of the kind that I know BBC have recruited in some number recently, and who were directed with a view to destruction of my research, that probably if they did this with the raw data, they'd probably come out with more bias, I would think, against the BBC.
But frankly, the point that has been made in relation to welfare reform dating back to the election in 2010 has been sometimes implicitly, very often explicitly, that under an independent Scotland, all of this would be done very differently. So actually the reporting of that is material to where there may be seen to be balance or bias within the reporting of political issues.
What I'm saying is what I found, and that's what I found in that period. Now, I don't want to comment on gut feelings about what I'm thinking at the moment, because I'm holding back until it's time to look at the material. But I suspect that you may be correct that there has been an increased tendency to associate Cameron and Osborne with particular initiatives as people, and to demonise the whole thing by consequence. In that year, there wasn't. But again, maybe you could dig up some examples and send them to me, and I can go and have a look back at it. And if I've missed it, I'll admit it.
Okay, I'll come back in.
Bring you back in, but other members waiting. Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. Morning, Professor Robertson. It's my view that in life we often see things as we are and not as they are. And so I'd like to ask you whether you accept that in research studies, coding of language is subjective, and that a person's worldview, their understanding of life and their views will have an impact on their decisions about language. And you, are as susceptible to that as anybody else. And I'm wondering how impartial you think you've been able to be in this process.
I'd agree entirely until the point at which you said I'm as susceptible. I've spent 30 years trying to be less susceptible and immersing myself in procedures that constrain me. So I don't think my performance is the same as the average person. It sounds tremendously elitist, I know, but it's been my job for 30 years. I do agree. All research into politics, social, economic factors and so on, you can present that research. I mean, I've been looking at some of the other papers presented to you for later this morning. I could jump all over quite a lot of that stuff if you wanted me to. And I think so I admit to that. So what puzzles me is, given that potential to have a critique and to have a debate, why didn't the BBC report it? Why didn't the Guardian report it, or the Herald, or why didn't anybody report it and then find a professor who disagrees with me and call me in and have me debate it with them? Why did they just suppress it? And I think it's because I think in the end there was a feeling it couldn't be, because they can't pin me down to membership of anything. They can't pin me down to alignment. You've suggested I'm human, which thanks. I'm a bit autistic, which makes me, I think, a bit more, more suited to this kind of thing than normal humans. I've wondered a bit there. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you. George Adam.
Good morning, Professor Robertson. I know your principal, Craig Mahoney, quite well, because he's obviously based in Paisley, so I was meeting him not so long ago, and I know exactly what he's like with these attitudes towards things. But I want to talk about, when you mentioned about, during in your written evidence and again, basically the personalisation of Alex Salmond, the First Minister, during that year period. You mentioned Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock, and they're a perfect example of how the media went out of their way to actually just go play the man and not the ball, effectively. And basically, I'd like to, some of the examples you've got here is that you've got down here in Reporting Scotland on the 23rd of the 10th, Alex Salmond under pressure. The same show on the 23rd of the 10th, 12, Willie Rennie challenges Alex Salmond's policy. And in the 25th of the 10th last year at 12th, Report Scotland's got Salmond as described by Joanne Lamont as a straight as a corkscrew, and then compared to Ruth Davison to bent salesman Del Boy. Now, these hardly seem like things that are going to be quite fair and open. And I look at your figures as well that you've got in your chart here, where it says personalisation of ideas, 35 for Alex Salmond, and personalisation of ideas is better together individuals, and you've broadened it out to take everyone else, absolutely 0. Now, does that not show, I would say that's quite an important part of your findings here, is that the debate is going down. If we're wanting to make the debate better, if we want to actually have that engagement with the public, we have to move away from this personalisation of the actual process.
I'm not a political scientist, I'm a media researcher, so I could agree with you, but I don't really feel tremendously expert on what should be done. I think that the media in a democracy should be open, should be open and self-critical. And I don't think, and that's what angers me most, is I think it's not self-critical. I think it's rather closed and cosy.
But just taking the figures on their own, like 35 to 0, that just seems. Mind you,
that's out of hundreds of messages, so you could argue it's quite a small percentage. If I were to take the other perspective, I'm not suggesting that in itself. I'm not suggesting anything about impact here. I did hint a little at there is some hard research evidence that bad news sticks, and bad news may affect voters. Bad news about the economy in particular does. It's not so clear, for example, whether the representation of Alex Salmond. My mum dislikes Alex Salmond very strongly. I don't know why, and I think it's just she just dislikes the way he is. And I think it's a lot to do with what she's seen and the way he's presented. So it may be that's had an impact. I don't know what she was like before the campaign. But again, were this the Crimea, we'd say, OK, pass, not bad, reasonably balanced. It's not really extreme, you have to say. This is by far the most civilised process in the world in terms of the attempt to separate one country from another. It's incredibly polite. And this research suggests the 3-to-2 ratio, I think, is of almost no significance. I think it's the respect for certain allegedly independent agencies, and it's the presentation of individuals that really counts.
On that, can I just ask, you mentioned some of the stuff that has no academic substance or value that's been part of the debate. Statements are made that just have no backing. Like some of the examples you give here is on the 5th of the 10th, 12, Report Scotland said the Scottish Government's commitment to universal benefits was immediately followed by the reference spending watchdog chief Robert Black, who has questioned whether such benefits are affordable, and reinforced the reference to Mr Black's CV. Now, I see that as an example of how some certain things are said and just left to hang there during the debate without actually doing anything.
Debate about whether or not Mr Black's CV is important. I suppose because I've played a similar card when I said that I'm not subject to subjectivity because of my training. I suppose you could argue that his CV gives him a certain entitlement to speak. I just think that if there are too many of those, it leads to a kind of imbalance. And I think there's a tendency of. I mean, I've not been treated with particular respect, far less than Professor Curtis, and I don't think I should be treated with enormous respect.
One of the examples you actually give is probably an example. You've been dragged into this because of your research, but effectively you've been told that you're like the equivalent of not a Premier League player, but Elgin City Reserves, which I take offence to because my wife's family's from Elgin.
I'm actually a Falkirk fan as well.
But one of the other things you've got here is a perfect example is in the 26th of the 4th report in Scotland, a general negative assessment of the future of insurance companies after independence finished with the line from a Labour spokesperson saying billions in cost, potential closures, and there's no actual substance behind all of that. There's no, it seems to be very one-sided. The Yes campaigns ask for give us answers, give us definites, and it seems to be just kind of fluffy lines at the end, billions it will cost.
Journalists will often say they're working under, and they are working under pressure of deadlines, and a lot of what they do, they will say isn't. I mean, I don't think what they do is a conspiracy as such. I think if journalists over a period of time produce an imbalance, I think that's partly random, and I think it's partly to do with their subconscious preferences, that they do that without really planning to. I don't think it's malevolent anyway.
Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. Can I also defend Elgin City? And can I just remind you that Inverness, Caledonia, Thistle and Ross County were in the Highland League, and look where they are now. But I have to do that because I'm a Highland MSP.
Of course.
Right.
Due respect.
Professor Robertson, can I ask you, do you favour independence for Scotland?
Yes.
So you favour independence for Scotland, and I have a quote here which says that you do, and I favour Scotland remaining part of a United Kingdom. So when I watch the same television broadcast as you watch, I tend to be more sensitive to comments, as Liam MacArthur has mentioned, about David Cameron, about George Osborne, really about any Conservative, and including my leader, Ruth Davidson. Whereas, would I be right in saying that because you favour independence, you are probably more sensitive to comments that are anti-independent?
Well, I've made reference to being slightly artistic, but I can't deny some kind of humanity and therefore weakness in that. And I've made it very clear that there is always subjectivity, and the way to deal with subjectivity in a democracy is to report it, and argue about it, not to hide it. Not to hide it because it's bad news. Yes. So I would agree with you. Can I just say, though, however, although I favour independence, I favour independence for many reasons which wouldn't allow me to join the SNP, for example. If we're going to, I believe researchers should surface themselves. There was a belief in the past that researchers should hide themselves, and teachers were encouraged to do the same. Hide who you are, otherwise you contaminate everything. My belief is if you actually surface who you are, you tell more. I would say that I'm primarily a socialist. I would put that before. I'm not a nationalist in that sense. I'm a socialist. I'd probably put in second position pacifist. So NATO is anathema to me. In third position, I'd say feminist. I think the abuse of women in Scottish society is an enormous scandal. You might even argue it should be the first place thing to be dealt with. It's horrific, the treatment of women in this country. And in other countries, obviously. So I'd put those three probably before any interest in independence. I've got this feeling that small countries tend to be more democratic, tend to be less likely to be imperialist states. I'm also an anti-imperialist. I condemn the history of the British Empire. It cannot be rewritten. The British Empire was a massive protection racket which brutalised enormous parts of the world. And in 100 years' time, historians will probably be hard pushed to say which was worst, the Soviet Union or the British Empire, once it's all out in the open. So I'm an anti-imperialist. So you see the nationalism's way down the line there. I'm a nationalist because I think the Danish seem to do it quite well. So I'd quite like to be like them.
You've actually just completed the quote that you previously gave. I'm a socialist, pacifist, feminist and anti-imperialist, and the latter position inevitably means I do favour independence for Scotland.
For small countries.
But could I just, as an academic before, for 20 years before coming in here, but I lectured economics as opposed to your topic.
Miserable science.
Can I just say, Professor Robertson, would it be fair to say that another researcher in your shoes with, you know, my thoughts, my views, my values about favouring Scotland remaining in a United Kingdom would be able to interpret the same information in a different way. But because you favour independence in Scotland, and you've confirmed that today, which is fine. And obviously in a democracy, I welcome your views. I think the views of academics are as important as any views expressed in this Parliament. I feel that very strongly. But do you think another researcher looking at the same information could have come forward with a different conclusion if they favoured Scotland remaining in a United Kingdom?
There's a to a point. Again, I'm going to make this arrogant claim for exceptionalism. I think if a researcher has been at it for 30 years, and if they use grounded theory, and if they're committed to allowing evidence to emerge as modern researchers are, I don't think they could have come out of this evidence with a hugely different picture. In fact, I would argue, you see, I did this, I've referred to multiple phases of coding. You can't just collect all the stuff and code it once, because what you see as you code changes how you might have coded what was earlier. So I coded it twice. Big task. It takes absolutely ages. I coded it twice. The first time through, I came out with a stronger imbalance against the Yes campaign. A stronger imbalance. And I went back through again and I thought, and I looked at sentences and I thought, I think that still is. I think that still is a pro-no statement, but it's not so obvious. And somebody else might disagree with me. And I dropped them. And so the category, which is where everything else goes, grew bigger on the second. So, but I have to agree that in the end, that you know that I come with baggage, and I can't entirely escape it. But I've done my level best.
We all come with baggage. Can I just say that the BBC have said that you singularly failed to define fairness and insulting language, and it really is what may be unfair to you may be fair to me, and insulting language could be subjective. Is that reasonable?
There were very few examples of that, you have to say. They were very, I mean, in terms of the number of messages.
They were looking for your definition. They said you failed to give a definition.
You're right, I didn't give a definition. I used examples, and the examples that, sorry, George gave earlier, they were almost entirely from Joanne Lamont, aimed at Alex Salmond. Almost entirely, not entirely. Sometimes from your own leader, which would be something straight as a corkscrew. I don't think there's any ambiguity in that. It's an insult.
Just my final question, Convener. Can I also refer to, it's out of paper, page number 5, and it's the examples that you've mentioned. The first one is on Scots savers and financial institutions might be at risk. I mean, we've discovered this week that EU legislation mean that financial organisations such as Royal Bank of Scotland, etc., they have to be based in the area where the majority of their customers are. So, you know, there is uncertainty, and George Adam rightly mentioned things are hanging in the air, and I agree with that. But do you appreciate that many people out there are concerned? There are big questions to ask. And the other one you mentioned is the subsidy for renewables. At the moment, this subsidy falls on a United Kingdom-wide population. Yeah. The subsidy would fall on 2 million households for renewables. Do you understand that these are talking points? And at the moment, because there's no pre-negotiation there are no answers.
I do understand that. I should say that, I mean, you'll be far more knowledgeable than I am about what's happening.
So.
Well, no, with regard to the politics, I'm only interested in the representation of the politics.
Well, you've used these examples.
And I mean, well, I agree. I agree that's selection. I agree that's subjective.
Yes.
I'm just saying, but they were examples. I'm not saying they're true or false. I'm saying these are bad news examples, and I'm saying there were lots of bad news examples. I'm not for a minute suggesting that anybody was wrong in what they said there.
Is it not
I'm just
fair
saying they
for
were presenting bad news.
Is it not fair for the BBC and others to be part of this debate and to highlight risks where and uncertainty where they feel they exist? Is that not an obligation on behalf of the freedom of the press that they have to do in a democracy?
Sure, but they do have, and one of the reasons the BBC were so angry, or the head of policy was so angry with me, is because the BBC have a charter where they're committed to fair. Well, fairness is not the word they use, of course, but they're committed to impartiality. And so if they're reporting negative stories more than positive stories, that opens them to the suggestion of impartiality.
A number of members who want to go in, so I'm going to take them in the order that I'm going to bring in members who have not spoken first. So I'm going to bring in Neil, and then Colin, and then others.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Professor Robertson. We heard just there you're in favour of Scottish independence. Is it your belief, stated publicly, that you think the Labour Party is fatally corrupt?
Have I said
hold on a second, Mr. Robertson, hold on a second. We are asking Professor Robertson about his views with regard to his research. His personal views, and I did allow the question from Mary Scanlon because I can see the relevance of it, but we are not going to get into a personalisation situation here, Mr. Bibby. So if you want to ask, well, I'm going to, if you want to ask questions about the research, then that's fine, but we're not going to get into that area.
There's a quote from an interview I think you gave to Open Democracy where you said there are good people in the BBC. Mindless loyalty to now a frightfully corrupt Labour Party is not uniform.
I don't think I should have said that last bit. I think the first bit I should have said, because I'm not having a go at the BBC. I'm not having a go at anybody, except defensively now because they had a go at me, and I don't see why I should take it lying down. I think the fatally corrupt Labour Party thing was inappropriate. Okay. I regret saying it.
If you're using the phrase fatally corrupt, do you still believe that BBC employees are loyal to the Labour Party?
I don't know. I think Kirsty Work is.
Where is your evidence for that?
We're jumping all over Alex Salmond on television every opportunity she could get. Anyway, we're kind of wandering off this research into my personal views.
I mean,
or is that because you think that undermines the research?
Well, I think you know, your view appears to be that okay, you've retracted what you said about the Labour Party being corrupt, but
no, I haven't retracted it. I've regretted it.
Okay, so you
I don't retract it. No.
Okay, so you.
Sorry, I'll give you a little more time. I really don't want... I mean, we have got a limited amount of time, and Professor Robertson's here to talk about his research that he has published. If we can stick to that, then I'm more than happy to take questions from you, Mr Bibby, but let's stick to the research.
In a sense, I mentioned at the beginning that I'm a socialist and a pacifist. That means there's virtually no mainstream political party I can hold in high respect in this country. Okay, none of them. None of them.
My last question in this line was, to just sum up the point, when it comes to accusations of political bias, you're not a neutral observer, are you?
Political bias? Who have accused of political bias?
When it comes to your
I haven't accused anybody of political bias. I've condemned the reaction to my research as undemocratic and as unfair and unethical. I think would be probably appropriate. I haven't condemned anybody in the research at all. I've observed something which I thought might be of interest.
Well, I thought the line mindlessly loyalty to now fatally corrupt
That's
Labour
not in my
Party
research, is it?
That was part of an interview you did with Open Democracy. But
I agree. That was, you know, you say things in interviews. You'll have said things in interviews.
I think that was an interview you did following your research.
Sorry, I'm going to stop this now because this is about the research that Professor Robertson has published. I'm not going to get into a personality spat between members of this committee and witnesses. If you want to ask questions, and it's any member, about the research, then please do so. but we're not going to get into attacks on individuals about their personal views, which are nothing to do with the research that they've published. Colin, please. Colin Beattie.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. The first one is very brief. I notice you referred to phase 1 of your survey. I presume that refers to the period from September 2012 to 2013. Is phase 2 then the next year?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And that is going ahead?
That's currently underway, but I'm not looking at it. And also, I mean, you mentioned things happening in politics. I'm trying to kind of stay back a bit from engagement, because I really do value the role of the researcher, and I acknowledge I will let slip gut feelings and emotional viewpoints and so on. I've admitted to being human in that respect, but I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best to hold back. So therefore, the whole 2-year survey, plus of course a review of literature and references. I was given a row for not having enough references, so I think I only got a C for my essay. That will appear in a book, which is already in a chapter. It will be in a chapter in a book with other media academics, including those I've condemned today for not supporting me.
The second point I wanted to make was I was very interested in where you were discussing evidence from sources other than the political parties, purporting to be independent or whatever, or I think you referred also to academic or scientific. And you mentioned the Office of Budget Responsibility Institute of Fiscal Studies, which are very frequently, in my mind, used to support evidence that's put forward. And yet you made the statement, notably, there was very little use of such evidence in the reporting overall.
Maybe this is a slightly teacherly sort of reaction to it. You know, I do kind of, online debates with students, postgraduate students and so on, and if they're not making heavy use of evidence and references, then they're slammed for that. And I thought in this very important political debate, I just thought it would seem quite rare for any kind of academic to appear, apart from one or two regular pet. And obviously I'm not a pet. I don't know whether I come across, am I a bull terrier academic or something? I don't know. It seemed to me not very much, given all the statements, lots of statements of opinion by political editors. Brian Taylor over and over again saying what he thinks, and yet hardly a professor or another academic saying what they think about similar things.
I find it interesting because, as I said, in my mind, it seems to be very frequent that these references are made, and yet you've actually done the count. And you're saying there is very little use.
Do you mean some of the recent? I mean, there's been a run recently, I think, hasn't there, of chief executives saying things? Is that what you mean?
No. I'm specifically thinking about the examples you gave, the IFS and the OBR. Yeah. Because they seem to be for a long time now, they seem to have been very frequently mentioned in the press. To support often.
Bear in mind, it's only the television coverage I did. I didn't do. I mean, the press coverage is another matter. They'd have more time, I suppose, more space. Yeah. But I mean, I can only say that's what I found. Yeah. That's what I found. I did my best to let it be found. And
interesting anomaly. Thank you.
Thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. Professor Robertson, you started by, I think, framing the research in your interest in the issue of censorship of the media. And George Adam earlier referred to the comment in relation to the report in Scotland from October 2012, where Watchdog Chief Robert Black has questioned the affordability of the Scottish Government's commitment to universal benefits. His CV gives him an entitlement to speak, I think, is what you said. Well, he's the Auditor General. Or he was the Auditor General, and therefore, if concerns he was raising, and auditors tend to speak in terms of concerns and raising questions rather than giving endorsements, generally speaking, that if you were not being quoted and that story were not being reported by Report in Scotland, do you think that would be a greater concern?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, regardless, I mean, I do agree if someone has a CV in a certain area, that we should be interested in what they have to say.
But he has a statutory role.
Well, the CV is the evidence of his. Oh, you mean his current role?
But no, he's now demitted that office. But his role was a statutory role. In terms of
he doesn't have that role just now, you're saying.
Well, he's no longer...
So his CV is accurate, I think I'm saying. If I say CV, that's what it is. It's not his current role.
Right, but he would have been being interviewed on the basis of the concerns he expressed
his previous
for
role.
his Auditor General.
Yeah, and I would refer you to your colleague over here that he too will be subject to bias and to baggage and so on. The fact that he's... That's we're all human. Why? No?
All human is a fairly reasonable statement.
That's a fairly reasonable statement, but we're into, I think, fairly dangerous realms if we're impugning the reputation of Auditor General.
I impugn that he's human, that he may bring certain perspectives to bear. The point is that
his role as Auditor General, with respect, is to question and highlight areas where whether it's further answers or clarity needs to be provided, or whether the figures that have been presented don't necessarily add up in the way that
but he's a political animal like all other people involved in this. He will be political too. Now, I don't know this. I don't know anything about him. But reporting Scotland, I don't think the other channels mentioned them. I don't think STV mentioned them that night. So you seem to be implying that this has to be paid attention to. This particular statement has to be done. But journalists choose. And sometimes they choose the chief executive, BP, or Shell, or whatever, and the other channel doesn't. And sometimes they choose different ones. I'm not arguing with the veracity of anything being said. I'm arguing about the overall picture.
And simply because the Auditor General has sought to raise questions about an approach that the government is taking in one area, that somehow is a reflection of inherent political bias in the Auditor General.
I haven't said that at all.
Well,
I haven't said anything like that. And if you were to read what I've written there, what I've said is that's an example. It's an example of bad news. And it was an example of bad news contradicted. It was an example of bad news treated with deference. That's just an objective statement. I'm not saying it shouldn't have been.
But there seems to be an implication that because we're going through a process leading up to the referendum in September this year, that every issue, however it's perceived, if a negative perspective is taken on it, somehow this is part of an anti-independence approach. I mean, I would encourage you to watch much of the reporting of the UK government by the BBC, and one could equally say that is a pro-independence approach, and that it plays into the argument that Alex Salmond and others within the Yes campaign are trying to prosecute.
You're kind of setting me up as some kind of political scientist of sorts, which I'm not. I'm a media researcher, and I have just described something that happened, and I've thought it was fair to code that as an anti-independence statement, one that would worry people who are voting for yes. And it was presented without being countered, and it was presented as if it were of unquestionable high status. I'm not saying it wasn't. I know. I know nothing about what his area of expertise. I think I just, without really having any emotions about it, I just looked at it and thought, negative. It's a negative. It's an uncontradicted negative, and it's a deference approach to the whole thing. What's wrong with that?
The fact that Auditor Generals have been raising questions about governments of all political views, that is their role.
Should he be
General,
just
before we move on, can I just clarify? Perhaps you can help us here, Professor Robertson. Was Bob Black, at the time of that statement, the Auditor General or the former Auditor General?
I don't remember, but former, I think. I'd have to check my records.
So I think he probably was the former Auditor General. You keep repeating that he was Auditor General. I don't think he was at the time. We can clarify that.
Right.
No, I think
there's clearly a difference. It creates a different impression if he's Auditor General.
To be fair to Liam, I think he admitted that at some point. He was unsure.
In terms of your written evidence to the committee, you've referred to it on a couple of occasions here this morning. You seem to draw a link between both the OBR but also the Institute of Fiscal Studies with the UK government and other government departments. Could you explain in particular the Institute of Fiscal Studies link to the UK government and government departments?
I've known of the Institute for Fiscal Studies in previous research, and I know that they are aligned with a particular view of economics, which is neoliberal. And I think to describe themselves as impartial is inaccurate, because they are a political movement also. They may not see themselves as such. Now, this is not me coming at this from the point of view of someone with a view on independence. This is my view of the intellectual world and the impartiality of the intellectual world. There are far too many agencies in this world try to present themselves, the World Bank for whatever, who try to present themselves as somehow outside of ideology. And I think that's wrong. And I think the Office for Budget Responsibility, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, are clearly aligned with certain ways of thinking which are political. I'm not. I'm not saying we shouldn't be listening to them at all. I'm just saying that here were examples. Here were examples of bad news coming from organisations presenting themselves as impartial, and I cast a little doubt on whether any of these organisations are impartial.
So then when the First Minister, for example, quotes favourably the Institute of Fiscal Studies where it is critical of the UK government, he is misguided in that role. And John Swinney, who is talking about the establishment of an equivalent of the OBR in Scotland, is misguided in that approach. Again,
you're turning me a professor of politics. I'm just observing what was there. I'll leave you to draw the conclusions as to whether anything should be done about it, or whether it was politically. I've tried to describe what's there as coldly and as impartially as I can, and the fact that I have become in favour of independence for Scotland, I think is, I don't know, should I have just kept quiet about that? I don't know, just said nothing at all about it. I've become more so because of the No campaign, I have to say, because of the research has made me slightly more in favour of independence, but it's not a big deal for me. It's not driving me. It absolutely is not driving me. It comes way down the line after pacifism and other issues.
Thank you. And finally, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I probably should have put on record earlier on, Professor, that I have worked with a number of students from the West of Scotland University. Obviously, we have a campus in my region too, in the Hamilton, and recently had one of the journalism students in work experience in my office. I should also like to put on record, I know Mrs Scanlon gave the example of George Osborne's concerns regarding financial institutions and where they have to be, but I believe that the European Union is actually reviewing those rules at the very moment, and they're unlikely to, from current reports, to be carried forward. I would just like to ask, obviously it's been a very far-reaching discussion this morning, but I do have a sort of fundamental concern, perhaps, about your opening statement and what's happened here. And I wondered if you would be willing to give an opinion on the impact that your academic peer-reviewed research has had on the students at the university, and indeed the reputation of the university, which, of course, we're very, very proud of in Scotland.
I think it's probably too early to say. When Mao Zedong was asked about the lessons to be drawn from the French Revolution in the 1950s, he said it was too early to say. So I doubt whether, according to the head of policy at the BBC, I've damaged the corporate reputation of UWS. That's why he reported me to the principal, because he thought I may have damaged the corporate reputation. There are other kinds of reputation, of course, apart from corporate. I haven't used this material with students because it's just been this year. I do use my research with students to demonstrate how to do research, but I haven't. This is too recent, so I can't really comment on that.
Thank you, Professor.
I think it'll be mixed. It'll be mixed. There's been a huge amount of online activity, which younger people are more engaged in. Someone suggested to me that the traffic, the number of messages online referring to my research, this is across Twitter and things I don't use, is about 250,000. So the fact that it didn't make the Telegraph or whatever maybe isn't a big deal. Again, I'm being drawn off on to things I shouldn't be talking about.
Thank you very much. Can I just finally, just as we're finishing, ask you a direct question about the research results? You mentioned the 3-to-2 ratio wasn't a headliner for you, if I can put it that way. But across, I'm looking at the column in your data about the Reporting Scotland and BBC One combined figures. And where there's, in those lines where there's a comparison between the two sides, for example, pro-independence, anti-independence numbers, 211 pro, 317 anti, and then pro-independence academic, 4, anti-23, anti-pro-order, 79, pro-anti-order, 43. We've mentioned some of the other ones. I won't list them all now. But in every single one of these comparison pieces of data, the numbers are greater on the no side than the yes side, in every single one. Yeah. Is it possible over a 12-month period that could happen just by random accident?
I don't think it could happen in a random way. I think it suggests something structural, and I think I explained early on, and I think after others, that there was a tendency to allow everyone amongst the major parties to speak. So that there are three major no campaigning parties. There's one major yes campaigning. So if everyone was being given amongst that group, obviously leaving out the Greens and the Socialists and so on, who are presumably considered too small to be allowed to comment very often, then you might actually have got something like a 3-to-1 ratio, you could see. Often the comments are very short. The Lib Dems would be given barely a sentence. So I think that can lead to an imbalance, which doesn't really matter a huge amount, I don't think. But I don't know, because this is not a study of effects. I haven't interviewed potential voters. I don't know. I'll have to leave that to Professor Curtis to interview.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Robertson, for coming along this morning. We do appreciate you coming in, giving us your evidence and discussing your report. And I'm sure we'll all look forward to your future publication when it's finally completed
when it's all over.
After 2 years. Thank you very much. I want to suspend the meeting briefly to allow the witnesses to change over.